I wonder what trajectory you would say your life is on right now. Are you heading pretty much in the right direction, aiming for somewhere around the bullseye? Or perhaps you'd say that your feeling is that actually you're lacking momentum in life at the moment. You haven't got enough oomph to keep you going, and so it feels perhaps like you're always falling short of the target. Or maybe for you, you're powering forwards. You've got the energy, you're keeping going, but maybe you keep finding as you power forwards that your aim is off and you're missing the target by a mile. The last few weeks on Sundays in our sermons, we've been focused on the account of Israel returning to Jerusalem from their exile to rebuild the city, to rebuild the temple. But not all of them returned. There were many exiles who stayed in Persia. What went on with them? Because they weren't part of that main storyline of the rebuilding of Jerusalem, does that mean that they were off target? They were on another track, and did they still matter to God? Well, we're going to look this morning at the story, the book of Esther, which tells the story of what's happening in Susa, the capital city of Persia, where some of the exiles are remaining. And Esther is a particularly interesting book in the Bible. It's one of the few books that was actually really disputed as to whether it belonged in the Holy Scriptures at all. The main reason being that throughout the book of Esther, God is not mentioned by name. He doesn't feature, or so it seems. But when you actually get into the story and see what happens, what you find is although God isn't mentioned by name, you can see evidence of him at work all the way through. And what you find in the story is that even though he's not mentioned, and even though perhaps the characters in the story aren't always aware of it, God has been setting things up and preparing them all the way through to be on track to hit a bullseye. Now, the story of Esther is on a par with a good episode of EastEnders, to be honest. It's got dramatic plot twists, it's got incredible coincidences, there's threats to people's lives and last-minute rescues. It's a really exciting story to read. If you want a Bible book that's a really easy read, go for Esther, because there's so much action going on. So let's start by introducing you to the cast. And I've asked one of our small groups to help me out with this in their Zoom meeting. They're bringing their best acting skills for us. So first up, we've got King Xerxes, the king of Persia. Wealthy guy, lots of riches, and he is married to Queen Vashti at the start of the story. Then we've got Uncle Mordecai, a Jew who is fairly high up in the rankings in Persia, but he is Jewish. And he is looking after Esther. Esther is a Jewish girl. Her parents sadly died when she was young, and so she's been raised by her uncle Mordecai. But Mordecai all the way through has told her to keep her Jewish identity a secret. So she's incognito. She's Jewish, but no one knows. And then we have Haman, the baddie. He is the baddie in the story, and you'll see as we go on what he brings. So the book of Esther begins with King Xerxes throwing basically this massive party. The intention of it is to show off the wealth and splendour of his kingdom. Think back, do you remember when we had the Olympics in London? There was the Olympic opening ceremony which celebrated everything about our nation. It's that kind of idea, but this party lasted 180 days. It was ornate. Everything was more extreme. There was bling. And the climax of this party was a week-long banquet in his garden. There was fine drapes, there was mosaic pavements, and most importantly, there was plenty of wine. The passage says that people were allowed as much to drink as they wanted. And on the 7th day, the final day of this party, the story tells us that Xerxes was in high spirits from the wine. He'd had quite a bit to drink. He was a little bit tipsy maybe. And he decides to send for his wife, Queen Vashti, who's having her own party with the women separately. And he says, send for my wife. Let her come in wearing her crown and show her off to all the men so that they can see how beautiful she is. The message is taken to Vashti. And perhaps not surprisingly, she's not too pleased at being summoned by her drunken husband in this manner to show off in front of this room or garden full of men. And she refuses to come. King Xerxes is mad. So mad that he kicks her out as queen. No longer will she be queen. Get rid of her. And he issues a royal decree that every man should be ruler over his own household. Sometime later, King Xerxes sobers up a bit and he starts to regret his decision. He's missing Vashti and he's feeling lonely. But his servants have a great idea for him. They suggest essentially like this nationwide beauty pageant. They say, let's find the beautiful young women from all over the land and bring them into his harem and present them to him one by one so that he can choose a beautiful woman. And so that's what happens. All these women are brought in. They're given 12 months of beauty treatments to make them look and smell wonderful. And then one by one, they take their turn to spend a night with the king. Now, it just so happens that Mordecai's niece Esther is chosen as one of these women. She's taken into the harem. She has all the beauty treatments. And her turn comes to go to the king. And it turns out that the king likes her. In fact, he likes her so much, he doesn't just ask for her to visit him a second time, but he decides to make her his wife. So at this point, we have like a little side story almost, or so it seems, in the passage, where we hear about how Mordecai is out by the gates and he hears these two officers plotting to kill King Xerxes. So Mordecai goes and tells this to Esther and she tells King Xerxes and he's saved from that threat. There's only a few details about it, it's a couple of verses maybe, and the story moves on. But sometimes it's those minor details that are God setting things up for something significant later on. But we get back into the story, and so our baddie enters, Haman, the baddie. He's risen up in the ranks in Persia, and he's kind of King Xerxes' right-hand man. He's very much honoured. And so Haman manages to arrange things with King Xerxes that because he's so honoured, everyone should bow before him. Uncle Mordecai refuses to do this. And Haman gets in a bit of a grump about it. And as one naturally does when you're in a grump about something, he of course plots to have all the Jews killed.
There is an odd set of people scattered through the provinces of your kingdom who don't fit in. Their customs and ways are different from those of everybody else. Worse, they disregard the king's laws. They're an affront. The king shouldn't put up with them. If it please the king, let orders be given that they be destroyed. I'll pay for it myself. I'll deposit 375 tons of silver in the royal bank to finance the operation.
The king agrees and seals the decree with his signet ring, and the message goes out to every province that on the 13th day of the 12th month, everyone can kill all the Jews in their area. Mordecai and the rest of the Jews are not surprisingly quite worried about this. They are distraught. And Mordecai suggests to Esther that maybe she is the one who has the opportunity to do something about this. Maybe she could approach the king and get this decree reversed.
Everyone who works for the king here, and even the people out in the provinces, knows that there is a single fate for every man or woman who approaches the king without being invited: death. The one exception is if the king extends his gold scepter, then he or she may live. And it's been 30 days now since I've been invited to come to the king.
Don't think that just because you live in the king's house, you're the one Jew who will get out of this alive. If you persist in staying silent at a time like this, help and deliverance will arrive for the Jews from someplace else. But you and your family will be wiped out. Who knows, maybe you were made queen for a time such as this.
Go and get all the Jews living in Susa together. Fast for me. Don't eat or drink for 3 days, either day or night. I and my maids will fast with you. And if you do this, I'll go to the king, even though it's forbidden. If I die, I die.
So Esther bravely approaches the king. And as she does, he holds out his scepter to her, giving her permission to come to him. But she doesn't jump straight in with telling the story of what's happening and asking for his help. No, instead, she invites the king and Haman to a royal banquet with her, a meal that she's prepared for them. They have this wonderful meal. And as they reach the wine course, the king, who is filled with joy at this occasion, asks her,
"Now, what is it you want? Half of my kingdom isn't too much to ask. Just ask."
Here's Esther's chance. Anything she wants. Is she going to take it?
Here's what I want. If the king favours me and is pleased to do what I desire and ask, let the king and Haman come again tomorrow to the dinner that I will fix for them. Then I'll give a straight answer to the king's question.
So Esther hasn't jumped straight in yet. But let's think about Haman for a minute. He is feeling pretty good about himself. He's the one who has been chosen to attend this special intimate meal with the king and his wife. He's clearly in favour at the moment. But something's still bugging him, and that's Mordecai, who is still sitting there at the gate, looking miserable. But his wife has a plan. Haman's wife has a plan, and she says to Haman, have a pole set up, a 75-foot high pole, and in the morning go and speak to King Xerxes and get him to agree for you to impale Mordecai on this pole. Now that night, King Xerxes is struggling to sleep. I presume he's tried counting sheep, he's tried having a mug of Horlicks, nothing seems to be working, so he goes for the obvious next choice, and he has his servants come and read to him from the book of his reign, the book that tells the stories of everything that's happened while he's king. I imagine that would send quite a lot of us to sleep well, wouldn't it? So he's listening to these accounts of the last few years. And one of the stories that he hears is of the time that Mordecai overheard those officials plotting against him, and how Mordecai sent the message through Esther to warn him, to protect him. And the king says, did we ever actually honour Mordecai for that? Because that was an amazing thing he did there. I think he should be honoured. Now by this time, it's nearly morning, and Haman is on his way to talk to the king about impaling Mordecai on this pole. And so in comes Haman, and the king says to him,
"What would be appropriate for the man the king especially wants to honour?"
Now, Haman, who's been feeling pretty good about himself, remember, is thinking, this is me he's talking about. He wants to honour me. And so gets a little bit carried away with his suggestion.
For the man the king delights to honour, do this. Bring a royal robe that the king has worn and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crown on its head. Then give the robe and the horse to one of the king's most noble princes. Have him robe the man whom the king especially wants to honour. Have the prince lead him on horseback through the city square, proclaiming before him, "This is what is done for the man whom the king especially wants to honour."
Go and do it. Don't waste another minute. Take the robe and horse and do what you have proposed to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Don't leave out a single detail of your plan.
So that's exactly what Haman had to do, to honour Mordecai in that way. I don't imagine he enjoyed that very much, do you? But his day improved because that evening he had his second banquet with King Xerxes and Queen Esther. And the evening went very similarly to the previous night. They had the wonderful food. They reached the wine course. And the king said to Esther a second time,
Queen Esther, what would you like? Half of my kingdom? Just ask, and it's yours.
If I have found favour in your eyes, O king, and if it please the king, give me my life and give my people their lives. We've been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, sold to be massacred, eliminated. If we had just been sold off into slavery, I wouldn't even have brought it up. Our troubles wouldn't have been worth bothering the king over.
Who? Where is he? This is monstrous.
An enemy, an adversary, this evil Haman.
The king is furious. So furious, in fact, that he has Haman impaled on the exact pole that had been set up for Mordecai. But the problem isn't dealt with yet, because there's this thing in Persian law that if the king has issued a decree and sealed it with his signet ring, it cannot be revoked, it can't be undone, it can't be stopped. But thankfully, between them, they have a plan, and they issue another decree that the king seals that says that the Jewish people may defend themselves, that they may come together and defend themselves against their enemies. And that's exactly what they do. The Jews come together, they fight back, and they're able to destroy all of their enemies. And the Jewish people are saved. It's a dramatic, fast-paced plot. But let's consider the plot trajectory from the perspective of the Jews. So at the start of the story, we have this Persian king who is showing off. From a Jewish perspective, it's not great. Persia are the ones ruling. But then we lead into this beauty pageant, which Esther wins. And the question is her winning this pageant a good or a bad trajectory? You see, you might see it as actually this is great favour on her. She's gaining luxury beauty treatments. She's winning this high position as queen. But then from the perspective of what is good before God, we perhaps wouldn't see it as a good trajectory. Remember a couple of weeks back, Lydia spoke about the laws of not marrying in with other groups because it would lead them away from God. And what this is actually about is Esther being forced into a relationship with this king. And so while she may be experiencing a strange kind of favour, she's not in control here. The trajectory is not being set by her. But then we have a steep downward turn. Haman's plot to kill the Jews. This trajectory could take them all the way to the end. But the story doesn't continue on this trajectory. It turns. Esther has a banquet, and the king is pleased with her. and offers her whatever she wants. It seems Esther is starting to set the trajectory herself now. The king, when he can't sleep, happens to read about Mordecai reporting on the officers who planned to kill him, and has Mordecai honoured. Esther has her second banquet and tells the king of Haman's plot. Haman suffers the gruesome end he had planned for Mordecai. There's a little wobble here. The decree for the Jews to be murdered cannot be undone. But the king allows a second decree so that they can defend themselves. And not only do they defend themselves, but they defeat all their enemies. What I want to know, though, is what happened here that set that new direction, that changed that trajectory they were on. What triggered this point where the path turned off from where it could have gone? Esther makes a choice to take control of the trajectory that this story is on. And she does it by getting everyone to fast. I want to suggest to you that that decision to ask everyone to fast was critical to that turn. I'll be honest, fasting's always been a really tricky thing for me to get my head around. I've often struggled to fully understand what's it about. Why should I be abstaining from food? Why should that make any difference? Why can't I just pray? But I would say that it's a reasonable assumption that if the people were fasting, they were also praying, and that together, prayer and fasting set our focus towards God. So my daughter's recently started learning to drive, and she's getting pretty good now, but in the very early stages of it, as I was sitting in the car with her when she was practicing, it brought back for me some vivid memories of what it was like in those very early days when you're learning. I don't know if you can remember that experience of where you're learning to turn at junctions, and you've mastered steering the car, you've mastered changing gear, but doing both at the same time is tricky. And so as you're approaching the junction, you start to slow down, you take your foot off the accelerator a bit, maybe you start to brake. You get yourself in a good position in the road for making the turn. You perhaps start with the wheel and you look, don't forget you indicate, and you look down to the gear stick to drop down into second gear. And by the time you've got yourself into second gear and you look back up out of that windscreen, you suddenly realise that while you weren't focusing ahead, you've turned the car completely the wrong way and have ended up almost on the curb on the other side of the road. What went wrong? Your focus went to the wrong thing at a critical moment and you lost your trajectory. How often do we find ourselves on the wrong trajectory because we've taken our focus onto the wrong thing and we've lost our direction? If we want to make a turn in our lives, if we want to turn ourselves onto the right trajectory, if we want to be in control of the direction we're going in, we need to keep our focus on the thing that's actually going to help us make that turn. And there's one person who can do that for us, and that's Jesus. We need to keep our focus on him. Esther, when she needed to make a big turn, turned her focus towards God through that fasting and through prayer. But notice that she didn't just go and do that herself. She asked Mordecai to get all of the people to fast and presumably therefore pray. Turn your focus to God, but don't do that on your own. Why not? So, why did she not just fast and pray on her own? Why did she need others to join in with her? Well, I suggest it's because of what she had to do next. You see, it wasn't just a matter of fasting and praying. Esther had a brave step to take. She had to approach the king something that she could be killed for doing. That required a vast amount of courage. And even after crossing that initial hurdle of approaching him, she had to continue in her courage, holding her nerve, operating in wisdom as she worked out the right way to play this, the right moment at which to bring what she was really asking for to the king. Now, God could give her all of those things if she fasted and prayed on her own. And maybe if she'd done it on her own, yeah, it could still have happened. But by asking others to fast and pray with her, Esther showed that she knew it wasn't just in her own strength that she was going to do this. Yes, she was the one who happened to be in the position to have the opportunity, but she didn't necessarily have the strength herself. She needed others around her to support her through that. And that's something we need to know, that when we're trying to achieve something, when we're needing that courage, when we're trying to take a brave step, we can't always do it in our own strength. We need others to encourage us, others around us to help hold us on course as we look to God to change our trajectory. We can't do it on our own. So the people fast and pray. Esther fasts and prays. She takes her brave steps. She holds her nerve. She acts with courage and wisdom. And what we see is that everything falls into place. God has been preparing for this. God has got everything lined up, ready for this moment. Esther had become queen, as it says in that well-known verse, for such a time as this. Mordecai had overheard those officials plotting to kill the king and had that opportunity to tell the king through Esther so that he would be in favour for such a time as this. God has everything mapped up to get them to that bullseye, to save those people. And it all falls into place as they turn to him. What trajectory is your life on right now? Are you ready to make a turn? And if you are, quit looking down at the gear stick and getting distracted, but keep your eyes fixed on God. Get others in the car with you to encourage you. And be brave and start to turn that wheel. And maybe you'll see how God has been preparing you for such a time as this.